European honeybee and the declines in the agricultural sector. So Haagen-Dazs realized that a lot of their flavors were pollinated by bees, so they had this large public support campaign out, and they funded a bunch of research, and they're not the only industry that's interested in this issue for sure. But what we saw with chronic collapse disorder, which was something that happened in the U.S. with a very specific set of symptoms around it, it showed that by relying on the European honeybee, what we're essentially doing is putting all of our eggs in one basket. And that's, to me, actually very frightening. So this is sort of the worst case scenario. So there's this province in China where there's not enough bees to pollinate the apple crops there, so they have to hire human pollinators. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And people are so obsessed with avoiding this that they're bringing in as many bees as possible. So here we have Moby, who's a musician, but is also, according to the Center for Food Safety, saving tens of thousands of bees because in his giant Californian mansion, he has space to put a bunch of colonies back there, which I don't know if he is actively tending, but they might probably just be hanging out there while he's on tour or whatever he does these days. But he is considered, someone helping bees. You may have seen this, possibly the most successful Indiegogo project of all time, I don't know. These people in Australia invented this type of hive, and they marketed it as something that is so much easier on the bees because you just turn a tap and the honey comes out. So people can have their urban beehives but not actually have to touch the bees or see the bees or even get near the bees. You just turn on this tap. But the reality is you just ripped apart all of the comb so the honey could get out. And these people, this screenshot is actually out of date. They made $12 million with this new hive that was, helping the bees and so much easier. Bees, and the other issue is, of course, that people with these hives don't actually know how their bees are doing. So they could be sick or whatever. And so anyway, I'm really jealous of these people. It's pretty successful granting opportunity. So because there's such intense public support, which you've seen yourselves, we have a lot of emerging policy that's coming about in terms of pollinator conservation. So here I have a statement from the White House. Obama is all about saving the bees. We have this here is YY Bees, which is our Minister of the Environment, Glenn Murray, was at this site near the airport where they released 1 million honeybees to the area around Etobicoke Creek. And he is quoted as saying, basically that we're helping biodiversity by doing this. We have federal policy in Canada. This one's actually quite honest in that it says the regulations that they're proposing are to support sort of more of industrial use of honeybees, not so much just saving bees in general. And then many cities are thinking about or have reduced regulations in terms of urban beekeeping, and so the city of Edmonton here also has allowed urban beekeeping within their cities, and they're doing this to promote biodiversity and sustainable, agriculture. So we'll go back to Aldo Leopold, who I think has been quoted a couple of times so far. And this really, when I read this, I think about this bee situation and how far away we are from what this statement is meant to be. So a thing that is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So far I've been talking about the European honeybee, which is one species not native to North America, which is actively being managed in a way that people are saying is helping biodiversity. But there is a very strong case in the scientific literature for native pollinators and not relying on the European honeybee in North America particularly. So these are titles from some papers over the past few years, and there are many more. There are hundreds of papers on native bee conservation in recent years. So native bees provide insurance against ongoing honeybee losses. Wild pollinators enhance fruit set of crops regardless of honeybee abundance. Wild pollinators provide the majority of crop visitation across land use gradients. And then a recent study just a couple weeks ago found that actually when you look globally, 39% of crop visits aren't even by bees, they're by other animals. So this is all really convincing, and we have a lot of other pollinators. So here I have the number for globally we have about 20,000 species of bees. And I think the 20,000th was described at York University. So we're past that now. About 800 species in Canada, and that's just bees. So on top of that, we have wasps and beetles and moths and butterflies, and these are all really important pollinators. And this newspaper article here is from the Toronto Star, and this bee was a species new to science, identified by a PhD student at the time at York University, and it was literally a stone's throw from here on Brunswick Avenue as he was walking up to Spadina Station. So we still don't even know what our bee species are, let alone how we can conserve them. And you hear a lot about biodiversity hotspots. And I don't know if any of you knew, but we are in a bee biodiversity hotspot right now in southern Ontario. So if you look at the darker colors, these are the areas that have the most species in Canada. And in the Greater Toronto area, we have about, well, exactly 364 species of wild bees. So this is something that we should definitely be protecting and nurturing. So here I have some pictures of bees. They may not be what you might think of as bees. Sometimes they're not even yellow and black, they're green and blue. Most of them don't sting, most of them don't live in hives or colonies. Most of them live in the ground. So if you see sort of like a pile of sand and a bee hanging out, that's like one bee with her offspring. And most of them can't even sting. Some bees carry pollen on their legs, but then other bees, like this leafcutter bee, carries pollen on its abdomen. So there's a really high diversity of bees, and they all have different life cycles, different ecological requirements, and different things that they all need. So I personally work on bumblebees, which are of the 800 Canadian native bees in Canada, only 50 or so species. We have 46 species in Canada. So bumblebees are the ones that are like pretty fuzzy. They're cold weather adapted animals. They carry pollen on their legs. The fact that they're covered in this fuzz allows them to forage in cool, damp temperatures, such as our spring times and our fall. And unlike the honeybee, which you may have heard use the waggle dance for their communication with their hive in terms of where the good foods are, so in order to do the waggle dance, they need to have the sun, and that sort of orients them. Bumblebees use landmarks on the ground, and they memorize routes to navigate. So this is a really important, behavioral component to this pollinator if we're talking about pollinating plants on non-sunny days, which we have a lot of here in Canada. So these are eusocial insects. So right now we have our queens. I guess there's no. Our queens are overwintering. So unlike honeybees, they don't collect honey to be awake over the winter. They don't store food. They overwinter, and then in the springtime, once flowers start blooming, the queen goes out, and she's basically on the verge of starvation at this point. She's used up a lot of her fat stores. Once she has enough pollen to make a pollen ball and a nectar cup, she starts laying eggs. And then the eggs hatch, workers are produced, and then the workers go out and do all the foraging and the nest tending while the queens focus on laying more eggs. And then at some point, the queen switches and she makes new queens and males. They go out and mate, and then the mated queen overwinters and everybody else dies. So if you see a lot of big bees in the springtime and then small bees in the winter, they're not shrinking. You're just seeing the switch from queens to workers. These are some of our native bumblebees, and as you can tell, they're all completely different, and you can easily identify them to the species level just simply by looking at their color patterns. So we have the yellow bumblebee here. The light is a little bit difficult to see, but we have the brown belted bumblebee, which has a half moon of brown coloration there. The tricolored bumblebee, which always has yellow, orange, orange, yellow. This is the rusty patch bumblebee, which is the endangered species I work on. So it has a brownish patch surrounded by a yellow border. This is the common eastern bumblebee, which is the most common species we have here in Toronto. It has one yellow stripe. So part part of my PhD work was this study looking at the decline of bumblebees. So bumblebees, because they're so ubiquitous and people generally have felt fondly about them in the past, we have tons of historical data in museums and collections, which gives us a lot of information about what they were doing, in the late 1800s and since then. So for part of my PhD work, I visited a site in Guelph and surrounding area where a PhD student had done a study in the 70s, and I replicated his survey work and found that of the 14 species of bumblebees that he found in Guelph, 7 of them showed some level of decline. And some were more subtle declines, but completely absent from what he found in Guelph were these 3 species, including the rusty patch bumblebee. And the rusty patch bumblebee in the 70s was the 4th most common bumblebee species, and I didn't find a single one. So that was quite alarming. So after that, I went to survey, using museum records of where the species was supposed to be. I surveyed other sites throughout the US and Canada, its American and Canadian range, and I only found the species at one of the 43 sites that I looked at. Since then, I've been working with the Xerxes Society to assess the North American species, and we now know that about 14 of our bumblebee species show some indication of decline. So when you hear things like all of our pollinators are going extinct or declining, it's not completely accurate. I am someone who has studied conservation biology for over 10 years, specifically working on bees, and I can tell you that 60% of our bee species are of least concern, which means they show no evidence of decline. But that being said, there are some species which show extreme levels of decline by over 90% in just a few decades. So they're not all acting equally, is sort of the take-home message. And in terms of native bees, there are a few threats that we think might be threatening them, and this includes pathogen spillover, climate change, pesticide use, and habitat loss. When you read the stories in the newspapers, usually what you're hearing about is the European honeybee again, and you tend to hear a lot about pesticides because the European honeybee is brought into agricultural landscapes which have really high levels of pesticides. But what I'm referring to here are the native bees which occur in the boreal forests and outside of agricultural areas. So pathogen spillover. In the mid-1990s, we started mass producing vegetables in greenhouses, including tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. Honeybees don't do well in greenhouses because they can't navigate using the sun, and I guess there's a lot of them, so bumblebees are just a little bit more manageable. But the study in BC showed that 73% of the foragers that are managed bumblebees to pollinate the crops in the greenhouses actually just go outside for their forage. And it's understandable because those crops don't produce nectar, they only produce pollen, and bees don't want the fake fluorescent pink sugar syrup that they're being fed, so they go out and they forage on the clover or whatever is next to the greenhouse. This is some research I was involved in almost, I guess, 10 years ago now, which seems to have just flown by, but we looked at wild bees both close to greenhouses and wild bees away from greenhouses, and we found that the wild bees near greenhouses had much higher levels of parasites and diseases than the bees that were away from greenhouses, which indicates, so we know that managed bees have a lot of diseases. We know that when they're supposed to be foraging in a certain area, they do go to other areas, they interact with wild bees, and now we know that wild bees near these areas do have higher disease levels as well. And then more recently, because that was managed bumblebees, more recently it's becoming obvious that beekeeping, honeybees, can also be a threat to our wild bees. So here's Moby's backyard. Again, no one's really watching them or trying to figure out if they have any diseases, but because this idea of urban beekeeping and helping the bees by having bees in your yard is growing so exponentially, and the identification of parasites and diseases in insects is actually very difficult to do, especially without a microscope. There is growing concern that we're basically harming our wild pollinators through this practice. And there's actually a paper just published in Science 2 days ago on this exact topic about deformed wing virus and how it's being spread by humans through honeybee populations. Climate change is an issue for our native animals for a variety of reasons. This paper I was involved with looked at bumblebees particularly, and we found that the bumblebees are not moving north. So with butterflies, if you had two individuals, they could slowly kind of move north if the weather wasn't exactly what they needed and the flowers were moving north. But bumblebees, because they're central place foragers and they have to go back and forth to their hive, and there's only like a few parts of the colony cycle where they can really travel, it doesn't seem like they are adapting to climate change very well. There are a couple other ways that climate change might be impacting our native pollinators. The synchronization of when plants bloom in the springtime is changing. We don't know exactly how that's changing, but we do know that it is changing. We know that our bees are emerging earlier than they were, say, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. And we do know that that vulnerable stage where the queen is out on the verge of starvation is also when it's predicted that we will have more spring storms, which will take out whatever forage is there for her. Pesticide use, in terms of the other threats, I would say is probably a lower threat to our native bees, but it is still a threat in urban areas. This picture is from a Walmart parking lot in Oregon, where I guess there was an aphid problem, and the parked cars under the trees were getting aphid droppings on them, so they decided to treat all of these linden trees, which are flowering trees and pollinators, are attracted to it. And the Zerk Society was called out because there were 50,000 dead bumblebees on the parking lot ground there. So they had to spend a lot of money to rent cranes to cover the trees while they were in bloom so that other bees would not be affected by these pesticides. So these are the neonicotinoid pesticides that you've probably heard a little bit about, whereas they're not sprayed, they're more, the plant is treated with it either through seed treatment or some other way, and then the entire plant becomes sort of toxic, or it gets this insecticide in it, so the nectar, the pollen, the leaves, and the other tissues. Habitat loss is, a major threat to a lot of our native species, and this for wild pollinators can, be a few things. It can be not enough diversity of pollen and nectar resources. It can be the lack of food in one of the sections in the colony cycle. Bees in particular are very susceptible to being fragmented. They have this genetic structure that makes them really vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. And I put honeybees here because bringing in 40,000, 50,000 honeybees with a hive does reduce the amount of resources that is available for the native bees as well. So how can we promote native pollinator diversity in Toronto? So we just have a few things here. I don't know if it'll be very satisfying for architects because there's nothing you can really build. Forage habitat. Planting plants, but not just those pollinator habitats that bloom in July and August, but particularly focusing on plants that bloom first thing in the springtime, like willow, or things that bloom in the fall, like goldenrod, not everyone's favorite plant. And focusing on things that are drought and frost resistant. And then the other recommendation that I'm making is that, we shouldn't be using honeybee hives unless we actually need them. And in terms of nesting and overwintering sites, also very unpopular recommendations. They like rodents, so encouraging rodent populations, thatchy vegetation, long grass, rotting logs, leaf litter. I'm listening. So basically just keeping things really messy, and that's how we can support our native pollinators. So there are opportunities within our city to promote native pollinator habitat. There's a recent study in Montreal and Quebec City that showed that allotment gardens and community gardens are actually some of the most diverse places for native pollinators. And I guess that's because they do tend to be kind of messy. They're pretty heterogeneous. They have, all sorts of different plants blooming at different times. Green roofs, I've done some research on green roofs, and I have colleagues working on green roofs, and they show some potential, but they definitely do not, can't duplicate a natural area or even a community garden. In Toronto, we're actually pretty fortunate that a lot of our neighborhoods have maybe not wildflower gardens, but flower gardens instead of lawns, and the bee diversity is actually quite impressive in the city. So one of the things that I've been working on with the city is the signage in parks, because as I said, the majority of our bees nest in grounds, and they really like sandy soils. So before, say, 3 years ago, if a concerned mother, called the city and said, "Oh, there's bees all over the place here," because when they do nest, they nest. There's many of them. The city would just send over someone to like spray them and kill all the bees. But now we're putting up these signs. We call these bees the tickle bees, because if you don't bother them, they won't sting you. And now it's sort of this learning opportunity in the city that people can just watch these tickle bees. This is where they are. Try not to disturb them, but it's actually been really well received by the public. And I just added this slide recently. I personally, like the Toronto Wildlife Center, never really encourage, hands-on management of bees to try to save them. And, the bee hotel idea, the bee condo idea, people are really, people want to help, and this is sort of a way that people can help, but the reality is the science isn't super strong that it is helping. In fact, the science indicates that it actually might not be helping at all. So this study by Lawrence Packer and his PhD student Scott McIver looked at over 600 bee condos over a few years in the city of Toronto and found that about half of the occupants weren't even native species. 3/4 of the occupants weren't even bees, they were wasps. And the native bees in these bee condos were parasitized more than the non-native bees in the bee condos as well. So this is sort of like an indication that we might have, we might be causing more problems. And the other thing is these bee condos really focus on bees that nest in cavities, not ground nesters, which is what the majority of our bees are. So there's potential to change our native bee community by promoting this group of bees that generally isn't as common as the ground nesters would be. And then lastly, the cities also provide refuges from other environmental stressors. So in terms of climate change, the fact that we water our gardens and that the forage will still be there is really important. Toronto, we have a bit of a pesticide ban. I don't think that we're completely free of pesticides for a variety of reasons, but a lot of our horticultural plants that are visited by bees are treated with pesticides before planted, so that's a bit of a problem. And then previous to this urban beekeeping thing, cities actually provided refuges against the disease spillover from managed bees because we didn't have managed bees in the vicinity. So, all things to think about. Thank you.
Is there any value at all of non-native wildflower and other plant species towards conservation of native pollinators, or is it better to focus on native plants for their conservation?
Yeah, that's a tricky question to answer. Like I said, allotment gardens are a great place for bees, and almost none of those plants are native. So I think it's sort of different levels of support, and non-native plants are better than no plants, but native plants are better than non-native plants in a variety of scenarios. And in terms of getting urban gardeners on board, native plants are just great because they tend to be lower maintenance as well. And I guess there is that co-evolution aspect of native bees being co-evolved with our native plants as well, and just being able to work with the flower a little bit better in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Some of the major stressors for the bee populations that you mentioned were habitat loss, and it can be argued that it's relatively simple to have a wildflower garden. So I was just wondering if there's any, maybe for the land use planners who are ways that you can find, to connect fragmented habitats or increase their spread, rather than, I don't know if there's ways that all of these would be attracted to particular
Yeah, I mean, I'm working right now with the Nature Conservancy on wildlife corridors for pollinators. That's not something that people generally think about, but it is important that they are able to move around in these spaces. And you need to have the nesting sites, the overwintering site, and the forage sites, which are completely different habitat types, within 2 kilometers or whatever their maximum flight range is. So there are definitely things to think about in that sense. But on the other hand, there's I don't know if you've ever seen milkweed in your garden or in your neighborhood, but if one person on your street plants milkweed, somehow all of the bees find it. So they can fly, and it does seem like there is a little bit of, if you build it, they will come as well.
Do you know if bees can reach rooftop gardens on top of condos or other tall buildings?
There has been a brown-belted bumblebee on the top of the Empire State Building. That species is the males perch and look for females, and I don't think he was that successful from that height. I'm trying to remember what the greenhouses were at York. I think they were maybe 9 stories, and there was lots of bees up there. But yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of problems to think about with green roofs, and including exposure to wind and heat, and there's a bunch of things to think about with green roof design. So there is some potential, but there are concerns as well.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the difference for native bees, and I've heard a little bit about the bumblebee population being trucked from place to place to place to pollinate orchards and it seems like my image of bees is a much more kind of rural apiary and all that.
Yeah, so it's
very different.
Yeah, the extent of our use of managed bees is exponentially increasing, especially the almond crop requirements in California. So honeybees by the millions are being trucked from the northeast, where they might pollinate apples, all the way down to California. And you see these trucks, sometimes they flip over, and then there's just millions and millions of bees flying around. So the potential for disease transfer is pretty large. And then they also travel a huge amount of distance, which puts a lot of stress on the bees as well. So that kind of thing doesn't happen in Europe, because it's it's a bit smaller and more contained. We don't have they don't have the extent of transportation that we do, but we're talking about hundreds and thousands of colonies, and not only honeybees but also bumblebees as well in Canada. The bumblebee situation is interesting because it's native to Ontario, Quebec, and parts of the east. It's considered a native species, so it's actually brought into British Columbia for pollination and not tracked at all, because it's a native species and now has established outside of its native range in the West Coast, and we're trying to measure how that's impacting the native bees over there.
I was wondering how your research is sort of trickling out to Moby and his hipster friends. On the one hand, in London there's a huge enthusiasm for amateur beekeeping, and people celebrated that as a kind of urban reconnection, and in a way you don't want to discourage that, and yet if it is, as you say, the kind of the Trojan horse, has a strategy been developed amongst the kind of scientific community for thinking about how you work with that other constituency?
Yeah, another tricky one. So the beekeeping industry has really been the force behind the pesticide bans and a lot of the pesticide regulations. So we do need to work with them, because they have the ability to take on these big companies, but they also, in some sense, represent a threat as well. So the best we can do is, talk about, yes, we need honeybees in agricultural areas, and where the habitat has been so degraded that there's not enough wild bees, but also if you are going to do beekeeping, make sure it's someone who can recognize disease, who has proper training, that they're, there's, it's probably the trickiest part of my job at this moment. And it was interesting, because that science paper that came out 2 days ago, every other science or nature paper on bee declines has just traveled like wildfire. And then this one sort of takes the honeybee transportation and the human side of management under under consideration. And I personally didn't see it in the Toronto Star or all over Twitter. So there is some differences in what's being shared and what's not being shared.
It's taken up by raccoon articles.
Yeah, maybe.
I actually have a question. I mean, it seems like throughout this whole thing, especially someone who doesn't know anything about bees, I mean, I hear about gigantic problems like colony collapse, and then I see, individual hipster apiaries, what we want to call this. Like, how does one balance, like, as someone who doesn't know all this kind of stuff, gigantic problems over here, and these little small problems over here? I mean, this is a classic problem of like any kind of environmentalist kind of project. Like, is there good in these small projects, as far as like a public kind of engagement, consciousness, that kind of thing?
So when I talk to people about what they can do to help bees, I talk about Bumblebee Watch, because that helped us collect data. So if people are interested in sending us photos of bumblebees, then we can find rare species and we can track invasive species and that kind of thing. So that's like, if people really want to help us, the number one thing that they can do. And then planting, pollinator gardens and things. But in terms of urban beekeeping, that's not so much a bee conservation thing, and it's really an educational problem because people think like, oh, like we need more bees, I'll get more bees, like this is obvious. But they don't realize that, oh, we actually have 800 species of bees, and that is the one non-native one. So, and it comes, like, there's so much cultural, like, our upbringings, our storybooks, Winnie the Pooh, like all this stuff, like we're learning about honeybees throughout our whole lives, and then someone like me comes up and says, actually, that's a bee, it's green, it's on the ground, and like you should be saving that and not the honeybee. So yeah, it's tricky.
Sorry, just a commentary. Again, I work for the city regulation, and the question came up, is it legal to do beekeeping in your backyard? We're like, oh no, don't ask us these questions, because it's like opens up a whole door. But the chickens in the city as well. Everyone wanted to have chickens in their backyard, and then they ended up giving it to the animal shelter that they can't take care of them. But I'm glad to have learned this particular aspect, because now when we think about regulation, it's not only about is it a nuisance issue, but really can we think about our regulations as is this really a good thing for the environment, or like is this
Right, and I think if people knew that we were a bee biodiversity hotspot in Canada and that we need to protect our bee diversity, I think most people would be okay with that. Possibly more than having their next door neighbor have 50,000 honeybees in their backyard.
especially if it's like